While her mother wasn't home, her stepfather forced her to do dirty deeds inside the barn, but he had no idea who was watching, and his face paled when he saw that. Catalina hurriedly closed the bathroom door, leaned her back against the wood, and held her breath. Her heart was beating wildly, with the force of someone sensing imminent danger. She knew she'd seen him. It wasn't her imagination. Benjamin was there, in the hallway, with that look that made her feel naked, even more so than she already was. The damp towel barely covered her body, her wet hair dripped onto her shoulders, and the steam from the bathroom still hung in the air. Her hands gripped the edge of the cloth, as if with it she could protect herself from something that wasn't quite happening, but that felt ever closer. She took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "Calm down, Catalina. Nothing's happened." Yet, she told herself, though unease seeped into her bones. But something had happened. Benjamin had looked at her. Not with the eyes of a stepfather, not with the indifference of an adult simply watching a teenager walk by. No, his gaze was different. He scanned her slowly from top to bottom. His expression held something dark, something dirty, something that made her shudder with disgust and fear. She didn't see him out of the corner of her eye, nor was it a passing sensation. She saw him head-on, standing in the hallway, his body slightly bent, his eyes fixed on her damp skin. It was only for a second, but she felt her skin burn as if she'd been stripped naked with a single glance. She wanted to shout something at him, demand that he stop looking at her like that, but her lips didn't respond. In her head, the words were clear, filled with fury and contempt, but her voice refused to come out. Not because she lacked courage, but because, deep down, she knew no one would believe her. Fernanda loved him. She saw him as a good, hardworking, dedicated man. How could she explain what had just happened if she didn't even have proof? She couldn't say, "Mom, Benjamin looked at me strangely," because her mother would only see her as an exaggerated child, a troubled teenager looking for reasons to reject her stepfather. From the moment he came into their lives, her mother made him the image of stability, of the man who would finally save them from the constant struggle of surviving alone. Benjamin arrived with sweet words, with promises of eternal love, and with the ability to fix everything that was broken. He never raised his voice, never argued with her mother. He was the perfect man. For everyone, except her. Catalina didn't move from the bathroom for several minutes, waiting to hear footsteps fading away. When silence reigned, she peeked through the crack in the door. The hallway was empty. She cautiously left and locked herself in her room, securing the lock. It wasn't the first time she'd felt this discomfort with Benjamin. Something about the way he looked at her, the way he stood close, the way he accidentally touched her as he passed by, kept her in a constant state of alert. For the first few months, she thought it was just her imagination, that she simply wasn't used to having a male figure in the house. But there were more and more moments that made her doubt. A touch on her shoulder that lasted a second longer than necessary. A comment about her clothes that didn't seem entirely innocent. A glance at the dining room table when her mother wasn't looking. Small signs that made her feel as if she were being slowly hunted. She knew she had to get as far away from him as possible, but how could she do it without raising suspicion? When she went downstairs for dinner, her mother greeted her with a warm smile and a table full of food. Benjamin was already sitting in his place, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't undressed her with his gaze a few minutes earlier. "Come, daughter, sit down. I made your favorite stew," Fernanda said as she served the food on the plates. Catalina took her seat, avoiding looking at Benjamin. He, however, gave her a slight smile and calmly brought a spoonful of soup to his mouth. "How was your day, little one?" he asked, his tone affable, at odds with the feeling of threat she felt on her skin. Catalina pursed her lips and looked at her mother. Should she say something? Should she try to make Fernanda notice something in her expression? But her mother was calm, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside her daughter. "Fine," Catalina replied, her voice dry. Fernanda looked at her with mild concern. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing, I'm just tired." Benjamin let out a small laugh and shook his head. It's normal, Fernanda. Catalina's at that age where she spends her time with friends, exploring who knows what, and running away from home. You know how young people are. Fernanda smiled, not noticing the way Catalina tensed at the comment. I know. Sometimes I wish you spent more time with us. Catalina felt a knot in her throat. She knew what Benjamin was doing. She knew he was laying the groundwork for her mother to think she was a problematic teenager. Sometimes I just want to be alone, she said, with the most neutral tone she could manage. Oh, honey, but family is important. You can't be running away from home all the time. One day, we'll lock you up so you stay here with us. Right, Fernanda? Benjamin let out a soft laugh, but his eyes stayed fixed on her with something she couldn't describe. Catalina felt her stomach churn. It was a joke, yes, but there was something in the way he said it that made her feel trapped. Her mother laughed too, not sensing the tension. We should do more things together, she said excitedly. Catalina just nodded and forced herself to finish dinner, even though every bite tasted like lead in her mouth. When she was done, she quickly stood up from the table. I'm going to my room. It's early, stay a while with us, Fernanda insisted. Catalina looked at Benjamin, who leaned back in his chair with a calm smile. Yeah, stay, Catalina. No. She couldn't stay another second there. I'm tired, she replied coldly, and without waiting any longer, she turned and walked up the stairs. When she reached her room, she closed the door and quickly locked the bolt. She took a deep breath. She knew that house was no longer a safe home for her. She knew she had to find a way to stay away from him. What she didn't know was how much longer she could avoid it. A few days later, the forest seemed darker than usual. Catalina moved through the underbrush with light steps, careful not to step on any dry branches that could give away her presence. The cool night air hit her skin, but it was a pleasant feeling compared to the weight in her chest since that dinner. She had left the house under the excuse of getting some air, but in reality, she just needed to be away from Benjamin. She couldn't stand the way he watched her, the way he smiled every time she felt cornered. Something inside her told her he was playing with her, waiting for the exact moment to make a move. The wind whispered through the trees, and in the distance, the hoot of an owl broke the silence. Catalina closed her eyes for a moment and breathed deeply. She forced herself not to think about her stepfather, at least for a few hours. She didn't want to feel trapped or watched. She didn't know how much time had passed when she realized she had wandered farther than usual. She didn't normally venture so deep into the woods at night, but something urged her to keep going. She felt a strange unease, as if someone was watching her. She looked around, but saw nothing unusual. Just trees, shadows, and the distant glow of the moon reflecting off the wet leaves. An unexpected sound made her stop dead in her tracks. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It was something else. She stood still, trying to identify the source of the noise. A creak, then a whisper, almost inaudible. Her heart started racing. She slowly turned her head and spotted an old structure among the trees. An abandoned barn, overgrown with vines, and parts of the roof collapsed. She knew it was there, but she had never paid much attention to it. She had heard stories about it, rumors from kids who claimed it was cursed, that strange things happened inside. Catalina bit her lip. Something inside the barn had moved. Her instincts screamed for her to move away, to not approach the unknown, but the same part of her that was always curious and defiant pushed her to keep going. She approached cautiously, stepping on soft earth, trying to make no noise. The wooden door was slightly ajar, just enough for her to peek inside. A shadow. Catalina held her breath. There was someone inside. Fear ran through her body, but instead of running, she stayed in her place. It wasn't the silhouette of an animal. It seemed human, but hunched as if the person was weakened. Hello? Catalina whispered in the firmest tone she could muster. The shadow tensed. Silence. For a moment, she thought maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. Maybe there was no one there. But then, a dry sound. Something fell to the ground. Catalina slowly pushed the door open, allowing the moonlight to illuminate the inside. The barn smelled of old wood and dampness. In the farthest corner, Beside a pile of straw, there was a boy. He was gaunt, with pale skin and dirty clothes. He huddled in on himself as if he wanted to disappear. Catalina felt a chill. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said in a calm voice. The boy didn't respond. He just stared at her with glassy eyes, as if he were caught between sleep and wakefulness. Catalina took a step forward. "What are you doing here?" The boy blinked slowly. Then he tried to move, but he staggered and fell sideways. Catalina hurried over. "Hey." She knelt down beside him and touched his arm. His skin was burning. The boy tried to pull away, but he didn't have the strength. "Stay calm," Catalina whispered. He looked at her again, as if trying to decide whether he could trust her. I have to go," he murmured with difficulty. "You can't even stand up," Catalina pointed out, assessing his condition. His clothes were dirty, his hands scraped, and there were signs of bruises on his neck. The boy closed his eyes for a moment. Catalina felt a pang of concern. "How long have you been here?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know." Catalina looked around. No one knew she was there. No one would come looking for him. "I'll help you." The boy shook his head. "You can't." "Look at yourself," Catalina said. "You can't even stand up. When's the last time you ate something?" He stayed silent. Catalina sighed and stood up. "Stay here." She left the barn and ran back to her house. She snuck in through the back door, making sure no one was awake. She moved quickly to the kitchen, grabbing some bread, cheese, and a bottle of water. She knew that if her mother saw her, she'd have to come up with an excuse. She returned to the barn and found the boy exactly in the same position. She knelt next to him and offered him the bottle of water. "Drink." The boy looked at her cautiously, but took the bottle with trembling hands and drank greedily. When he was finished, Catalina passed him the bread. "Eat this." He hesitated. "I don't want to get you into trouble." "You won't get me into trouble if no one knows I'm helping you." The boy took the bread and bit into it desperately. Catalina watched him in silence. After a few minutes, when it seemed he had regained some strength, he looked at her more clearly. "Thank you." Catalina nodded. "What's your name?" The boy swallowed. "Emmanuel." "Emmanuel," Catalina repeated. "Why are you here?" Emmanuel looked down. "I have nowhere to go." Catalina waited. Emmanuel exhaled slowly. "My mother died. My father." He paused for a moment. "He didn't want me." Catalina felt a lump in her throat. "Did he hurt you?" Emmanuel didn't respond immediately. Then he nodded silently. Catalina felt anger building in her chest. "Is that why you ran away?" "Yes." Silence stretched between them. Catalina studied him more closely. It wasn't just that he was dirty or sick. It was the way his body shrank, the way he spoke as if he expected to be punished for saying too much. Catalina took a deep breath and spoke firmly. "You can stay here." Emmanuel lifted his gaze. "What?" "Until you're better. No one comes to this barn." Emmanuel seemed hesitant. "I don't want you to get into trouble because of me." Catalina shrugged. "I already have enough problems. One more won't make a difference." Emmanuel looked at her with what seemed like gratitude, but also with suspicion. Catalina felt something shift inside her. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone in her fear. Days passed, and Catalina knew she was playing with fire. Every night she escaped the house, every minute spent in the barn with Emmanuel, she felt like the world she knew was slowly falling apart, as if someone was pulling an invisible thread, and the fabric of her life was unraveling beyond repair. It shouldn't take too long. It shouldn't raise suspicions. No one should find out about Emmanuel's existence. But it was getting harder and harder to control her impulses. She no longer escaped just to get away from the house. Now she did it because she wanted to see him. Because when she was with him, the feeling of emptiness, of constant danger, disappeared for a few moments. During dinner, Benjamin watched her with sharp eyes, that half smile that sent chills down her spine, and she had to pretend everything was fine. Her mother didn't notice anything, or maybe she didn't want to. Every time Catalina seemed distant or nervous, Fernanda attributed her behavior to adolescence, hormones, that phase of rebellion that, according to her, all young girls go through. But Benjamin noticed the difference. "You've been going out a lot lately," he commented one night while calmly cutting his meat, as if the conversation didn't matter. Catalina froze, the fork halfway to her mouth. "Sorry?" Benjamin smiled, not lifting his gaze from his plate. "I mean, lately you disappear a lot. You used to spend more time at home. Now, you leave as soon as you can. Is there something more interesting out there than the company of your family?" Catalina swallowed. Her mother laughed lightly and shook her head. "Oh, Benjamin, you know how young people are. They always want to be outside, breathing freedom." Benjamin raised his eyes and stared at Catalina. "Of course. I just hope you're not doing things you shouldn't." His tone was light, but his words carried the weight of a warning. Catalina felt a chill run through her arms. "I'm not doing anything," she responded flatly, returning to her plate. "I hope not," Benjamin said, and Catalina felt his gaze sweep over her, undressing her without touching. After dinner, she went up to her room and locked the door. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the trembling in her hands. Something inside her told her that Benjamin was suspicious, that it was no longer simple curiosity, but something much more dangerous. Night fell, and the house grew silent. Catalina waited patiently, making sure her mother was asleep before slipping out of the room. She moved quietly, avoiding the creaky floorboards, and stepped out into the backyard. The cool air greeted her like an embrace. She ran toward the forest, feeling her heart race in her chest. Each step that took her further from the house allowed her to breathe easier. When she reached the barn, Emmanuel was waiting, sitting against one of the wooden walls. He looked healthier, his skin no longer as pale as when she had first found him. "You're late," he said with a smile. "Don't keep watching me," Catalina joked, dropping the bag of food she had brought. Emmanuel grabbed it and started eating quickly. "Everything good at home?" he asked between bites. Catalina collapsed onto the hay and sighed. "Benjamin's suspects." Emmanuel stopped chewing and looked at her seriously. "Suspects what?" "I'm not sure exactly. I just know he's watching me more than usual." Emmanuel set the food aside. "If he suspects, you need to be careful. If he finds out you come here." Catalina looked him in the eyes. "I don't care what he finds out." Emmanuel stayed silent. There was something in the way Catalina said those words, in the hardness of her voice, that made him understand that the problem wasn't just her hiding it. "Has he done anything to you?" he asked, his voice lower. Catalina looked down. "No, but he will." Emmanuel felt a knot in his stomach. There were no more details, but he didn't need any. He saw it in her expression, in the way her body tensed, in the fear disguised as indifference. "If you ever need help," Emmanuel left the sentence hanging, knowing that Catalina wouldn't accept any offers. She smiled, but without joy. "I don't need saving." Emmanuel looked at her carefully. "I'm not here to save you. I'm here to be there when you need me." The silence between them felt heavier this time. Catalina diverted her gaze and changed the subject. "How have you been feeling?" Emmanuel understood that she didn't want to keep talking about it, so he simply nodded. "Better. Thanks to you." Catalina smiled slightly. "I like having a secret." Emmanuel raised an eyebrow at her. "A secret?" "Yes, you're my secret." Emmanuel didn't know how to respond to that, but something in his chest warmed. The night went on, and they both stayed there, sharing stories and quiet laughter. For a while, Catalina was able to forget the danger that was lurking in her own home. But the danger hadn't forgotten about her. When she returned home, she made sure to enter without making a sound. She quietly climbed the stairs and went to her room, locking the door behind her. And then she felt it. A presence. Not in her room, but outside, in the hallway. She held her breath and approached the door. She heard breathing. Someone was there. Desperation paralyzed her. For long seconds, she didn't move, hoping it was just her imagination. But then, the sound of footsteps slowly moving away made her feel a fear she had never experienced before. "Benjamin." He had been waiting. He had been listening. Catalina felt her heart pound against her chest. He knew, and he was waiting for his moment. Catalina stood still, her hand on the doorknob. Her breathing was shallow, her legs were trembling. She knew he was out there. She hadn't seen him, but she felt him. The wood of the hallway floor creaked. Her heart hit her chest with brutal force. The sound lingered slowly, as if someone was spinning on their own feet, as if deciding whether to move or stay there. After several seconds, the footsteps faded away. Catalina didn't move right away. She stood there, ear pressed against the door, listening with all the attention she could muster. She didn't dare breathe until the silence felt more solid. When she finally allowed herself to move, her fingers were cold and her chest ached. She walked to her bed, sat on the edge, and looked out the window. She couldn't keep living like this. Something had to be done. Her mother wouldn't believe her. No matter what she said, how she said it, Fernanda always found a way to justify Benjamin. But Catalina had no doubts anymore. Benjamin was waiting for the perfect moment. Things got worse the next day. After breakfast, Catalina locked herself in her room, claiming to have a headache. She didn't want to be in the same space as Benjamin. She avoided him all day, making sure not to be alone with him for even a second. But the house was small. At some point in the night, when she stepped out of the bathroom with damp hair wrapped in a towel, she found him in the hallway. Benjamin was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, with an expression that made her want to step back immediately. "You shouldn't go out like this," he said with a smile. Catalina felt a chill run through her body. "It's my house," she replied coldly. Benjamin looked her up and down, without shame. "You're so beautiful, Catalina. You shouldn't tempt men so much." The air grew thick. Catalina felt her blood freeze. Benjamin's smile remained. "I say this for your own good," he added softly, as if giving her genuine advice. Sometimes beautiful girls don't understand the effect they have on others. Catalina forced herself to move. She passed by him with a tense body, walking quickly toward her room. Before she could close the door, Benjamin whispered, "Sleep well." Catalina slammed the door shut and locked it. Her skin felt dirty. That night, she couldn't sleep. The next morning, she decided she couldn't stay locked up. She left the house as soon as she could, without even having breakfast. She walked aimlessly, but with a clear goal: to stay away. Her steps led her to the barn. Emmanuel was waiting for her, as always. "You came early," he commented, raising an eyebrow. Catalina didn't respond immediately. She collapsed onto the ground, her back against the wood. Emmanuel watched her closely. "What happened?" Catalina closed her eyes and sighed. "I can't stay in that house." Emmanuel frowned. "Did he do something?" Catalina shook her head, but her expression said otherwise. "Not yet." Emmanuel felt a pang of anger in his chest. "Catalina, I don't want to talk about it." Emmanuel pressed his lips together. He wanted to tell her that yes, she needed to talk about it, that she couldn't keep carrying it alone. But he knew that look. Catalina was a storm trapped in a fragile body. She was used to carrying everything on her own. He changed the subject. "I'm leaving." Catalina turned her head and looked at him with a furrowed brow. "What?" "I can't stay here forever. It's not safe. If Benjamin is already suspicious, it's just a matter of time before they find me out." Catalina felt her stomach twist. "You can't leave." Emmanuel stared at her intently. "I have to do it." Catalina felt a sensation she couldn't describe. "And where will you go?" Emmanuel shrugged. "I don't know. But it's better to be wandering than staying here, hiding like an animal." Catalina felt something similar to fear, but mixed with anger. "And what am I supposed to do?" Emmanuel looked at her seriously. "It's not fair that you risk so much for me." Catalina clenched her fists. "I don't care." Emmanuel sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Catalina, I don't care," she repeated, but her voice sounded more broken this time. Emmanuel moved closer and sat down next to her. "I'll be fine." Catalina looked down at the floor. "I don't want you to leave." Emmanuel felt a lump in his throat. "I don't want to leave you." They stayed silent for several minutes. Emmanuel took her hand. "If I stay, things will get worse." Catalina nodded but didn't say anything. When she got home, her mother was waiting for her in the living room. "Catalina, come here." Catalina tensed up. Fernanda had her arms crossed and an expression that didn't bode well. "Where have you been?" Catalina felt her heart race. "I just went for a walk." Fernanda shook her head. "You've been acting very strange lately. You come home late, disappear for hours. Benjamin is worried about you." Catalina felt a knot of anger in her stomach. "I don't care what Benjamin thinks." Fernanda looked at her in surprise. "Catalina, why are you talking like that?" "Because I don't like the way he looks at me," Catalina snapped before she could stop herself. Fernanda stared at her in disbelief. "What are you saying?" Catalina felt her breath becoming irregular. "What you heard." Fernanda frowned. "Catalina, do you know what you're saying?" Catalina felt like she was drowning. "Yes." Fernanda shook her head. "Benjamin is a good man. I don't know what strange idea you've gotten in your head, but I won't allow you to make false accusations." Catalina felt her world collapsing. "I'm not lying." "Catalina, enough." Fernanda's tone was sharp. Catalina felt the tears burning in her eyes. "I can't believe you don't believe me." Fernanda sighed and ran a hand over her face. "You're confused." Catalina took a step back. "No, you're the one who's confused." She ran up to her room and locked the door. She collapsed onto the bed, her chest rising and falling uncontrollably. She was alone. Completely alone. Catalina sat on the bed, staring at the closed door. Her mother didn't believe her. No matter how much she tried, how many signs she gave, Fernanda refused to see the truth. She knew what that meant. She was alone in that house. Anxiety climbed up her arms, making her skin feel like a battlefield where every nerve ending was on defense. She didn't want to leave her room. She didn't want to face Benjamin. After the conversation with her mother, she had seen his triumphant smile. She knew. She knew Fernanda wouldn't support her. She knew he had won. Catalina gritted her teeth. No, she wouldn't let him win. Fear was a weapon, and he was using it against her. But then she heard her mother's voice calling her from downstairs. "Catalina, come down for a moment." She stood up, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't want to go down, but not doing so would raise more suspicions. She forced herself to walk, one foot after the other, feeling each step bring her closer to a cliff. When she reached the dining room, she saw her mother with a suitcase by the door. "I have to travel this weekend. Something came up at work," Fernanda explained as she finished zipping up the suitcase. Catalina felt a knot in her stomach. "You're leaving?" "I'll be back on Sunday night." Catalina's head buzzed. "I can't stay here alone." "You won't be alone. Benjamin will be with you." Her body immediately tensed. Benjamin, sitting on the couch with a relaxed expression, smiled at her. "You don't have to worry about anything. I'll take care of you." Catalina's blood froze. "I don't want to stay here with him." Fernanda sighed in annoyance. "Catalina, enough. I don't want you to keep this attitude." Catalina felt the tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "Mom, it's just a weekend, Catalina. Please, don't leave me here with him." Fernanda looked at her tiredly. "You need to grow up. You can't keep acting like a spoiled child." Catalina felt her chest tighten. There was nothing more she could say. Fernanda kissed him on the forehead and walked out the door, leaving behind the sound of the car's engine fading away on the dirt road. The house fell into a heavy silence. Catalina didn't dare move. Benjamin slowly got up from the couch and stretched, as if the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. "Well, looks like we'll be alone." Catalina felt a pang of nausea. She took a step back. "I'm going to my room." Benjamin smiled lightly. "You don't have to lock yourself in. I want us to spend time together." Catalina swallowed and took another step back. "I'm tired." "Come on, Catalina. Don't be like that," he said, taking a step forward. She quickly turned and started up the stairs. Before she could reach her room, she felt a hand grabbing her wrist. Terror coursed through her like lightning. "Don't leave so quickly." His voice was low, soft, almost affectionate. Catalina tried to pull away, but he yanked her harder and made her spin around. "You're always avoiding me," he murmured, his eyes locked on hers. Catalina felt her breath quicken. "Let me go." Benjamin smiled. "I don't understand why you're so hostile toward me. I just want us to get along." He moved closer. Catalina's body stiffened as she felt his breath on her neck. And then, she felt it. The touch of his lips on her skin. Her stomach twisted in a mix of disgust and panic. She tried to push him away, but he wrapped one hand around her waist and pressed his fingers against her stomach. Catalina's world shattered. A ragged sob escaped her throat. "Let me go." Benjamin pressed closer to her. "You've always been so beautiful." Catalina felt despair choking her. She didn't think, she didn't reason. She just let her body react. She dug her nails into his skin and pushed him with all her strength. Benjamin let go of her for a second. Catalina seized the moment and ran. The hallway felt longer than usual. She flew down the stairs, 2 steps at a time, hearing the sound of her footsteps echoing in her own head. She didn't look back. She just ran. She opened the front door and rushed outside, feeling the cold breeze on her face. The forest, the barn, Emmanuel. Tears streamed down her face as she ran through the brush, with the pounding of her heart echoing in her ears. She felt that Benjamin could catch her at any moment. The shadows of the trees stretched out like arms trying to grab her. Adrenaline gave her speed, but her body was on the brink of collapse. When she reached the barn, she barely had the strength to open the door and close it behind her. Her chest was rising and falling uncontrollably. "Catalina?" Emmanuel's voice made her sob. He rushed toward her, grabbing her by the shoulders. "What happened?" Catalina clung tightly to his shirt. She couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. Emmanuel held her gently. "You're trembling." She simply nodded. Emmanuel guided her to the hay and made her sit down. His voice was low, calm. "Was it him?" Catalina shut her eyes tightly and nodded. Emmanuel felt the rage consume him. Catalina hugged her knees and let the tears drown her. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. But deep in her mind, she knew this was not over. Catalina felt her body shake with spasms of fear as she tried to calm her breathing inside the barn. Her hands were still trembling, and her chest hurt with every inhale. Emmanuel held her firmly, asking no questions. He was just there, letting her fall apart for the first time. But the moment of calm was broken by the sound of a footstep outside the barn. Catalina froze. Emmanuel tensed instantly and looked at her, waiting for her to confirm his worst fears. Catalina didn't need to say anything. Her terrified expression said it all. A sharp knock echoed on the door. Catalina felt the world closing in on her. "Catalina, I know you're in there. Don't make this any harder." Benjamin's voice was calm, with no traces of anger. But Catalina knew him well enough to recognize that this calm was just the precursor to something worse. Emmanuel stood up immediately. His jaw tightened, and his fists clenched. Catalina felt the despair rising in her throat. "Emmanuel, no," she whispered, but he was already moving forward. The door creaked as Benjamin pushed it harder. "You don't have to be scared. I just want to talk to you." "You shouldn't have run like that." His voice was almost paternal, as if he hadn't just tried to catch her at the house a few minutes earlier. Catalina felt dizzy. Emmanuel looked around the barn, searching for something he could use as a weapon. His eyes scanned the old tools, the stacked wood in a corner, the ropes hanging from the wall. There was nothing really useful, but he wasn't about to stay still. Benjamin hit the door harder. "I'm coming in, Catalina. Open the door now, and we'll talk like civilized people." Emmanuel grabbed a thick wooden stick that had been lying among the straw. He positioned himself between the door and Catalina, ready for whatever was about to happen. Catalina felt her thoughts become blurry. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let Benjamin catch them. The door shook. A dry sound echoed as Benjamin used all his strength, and then the wood gave way. Benjamin entered with a terrifying calmness, as if he weren't breaking into the barn in the middle of the night. His gaze swept across the room until it met Catalina's, who instinctively stepped back. Then he noticed Emmanuel. His eyes narrowed. "So this is where you're hiding," he murmured. Emmanuel didn't respond. He gripped the wooden stick tighter and took a step forward. Benjamin smiled, as though all of this amused him. "I don't know what Catalina's told you about me, but I'm sure it's not the truth. She's dramatic. You know how teenagers are. Sometimes they think the whole world is against them." Emmanuel didn't respond. He wasn't interested in talking to him. Benjamin sighed. "I'll make this easy. Catalina, come with me right now and no one will get hurt." Catalina felt her stomach churn. Her legs wanted to move, but not in the direction Benjamin wanted. She wanted to run, disappear, tear her skin off if that meant erasing everything he had done. Emmanuel stood firm. "Don't touch her." Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "And what are you going to do to stop me?" The tension in the room was unbearable. Benjamin took a step forward. Emmanuel didn't wait any longer. With all the strength he had, he lifted the wooden stick and swung it toward Benjamin's head. But Benjamin was fast. He moved to the side at the last second, and the blow passed inches from his face. Emmanuel barely had time to react before Benjamin shoved him hard, making him stumble into the straw. Catalina screamed. Benjamin approached Emmanuel with a look of superiority. "Don't be stupid. You can't beat me." Emmanuel quickly got up and, without thinking, lunged at Benjamin. Both of them crashed to the ground violently. The punches echoed in the barn, dry fists and grunts of pain. Catalina felt her body freeze as she watched Emmanuel fight with all the fury of someone with nothing to lose. But Benjamin was stronger. With a sharp motion, he slammed Emmanuel to the ground and grabbed him by the neck. Catalina saw Emmanuel trying to break free, but Benjamin had control. He was choking him. Catalina's terror turned into desperation. She looked around frantically. She needed to do something. Anything. And then she saw them. The pitchforks. Without thinking twice, she grabbed one and ran toward Benjamin. Without shouting, without warning, without hesitation, she drove the metal tip into his arm. Benjamin let out a scream and stepped away from Emmanuel, who was coughing violently as he tried to catch his breath. Catalina quickly stepped back, still holding the pitchfork in her hand. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly. Benjamin looked at her with an expression he had never seen before. It wasn't fury. It was surprise. "Catalina." She raised the pitchfork with both hands. "Stay away." Benjamin squinted. "You wouldn't hurt me." Catalina didn't hesitate. "Try and you'll find out." Benjamin gritted his teeth. Blood was sliding down his injured arm. His jaw was tight. For the first time, he seemed to realize he had underestimated Catalina. Emmanuel slowly got to his feet, still recovering from the fight. He stood next to Catalina, his gaze fixed on Benjamin. Then, before anyone could move, a voice broke the silence. "What's going on here?" Catalina felt her body freeze. Fernanda was standing in the doorway of the barn. Her eyes were scanning the scene with disbelief. She saw Emmanuel's face covered in bruises. She saw Catalina holding a bloody pitchfork. She saw Benjamin with his injured arm and torn shirt. No one said a word. The silence was worse than any scream. Fernanda slowly walked forward. "Is anyone going to explain what's going on?" Benjamin, always the manipulator, always the master of deception, was the first to react. He placed a hand on his bloody arm and let out a theatrical sigh. "Fernanda, this isn't what it looks like." Catalina felt her throat tighten. Fernanda looked at her daughter. "Catalina." Catalina swallowed hard. "He followed me. He wanted to catch me." Fernanda blinked. Her expression was unreadable. "That's not true," interrupted Benjamin with a bitter laugh. "She's confused." Catalina felt the tears well up in her eyes again. "I'm not confused, Mom. He's been doing this to me for months. He tried to touch me. He cornered me in the house. He kissed my neck." Fernanda seemed to sway for a moment. Benjamin shook his head. "Fernanda, are you going to believe this?" Fernanda didn't respond. She looked at her daughter. She looked at Emmanuel, who still had marks from the fight. She looked at Benjamin. And then, she saw him. It was just a flash, an instant. But she saw him, the way he looked at her, the tension in his jaw, the contained fury. Benjamin was not an innocent man. Fernanda felt her skin crawl, her stomach churned. The truth hit her with the force of an avalanche. Catalina was telling the truth. Benjamin was a monster, and she had brought him into her home. Catalina looked at her with eyes full of pleading. "Tell me you believe me." Fernanda felt like she couldn't breathe. She looked at Benjamin, who was still waiting for an answer. And then, she did the only thing she could do. She took the fork from her daughter's hands and pointed it at Benjamin. "Get out of my house. Now." Benjamin opened his mouth to speak, but Fernanda didn't give him the chance. "Now," she repeated in a voice she had never used before. Benjamin stood still for a few seconds. Then, without saying another word, he turned and left the barn. Catalina felt her legs give way. She collapsed to the ground, letting the tears consume her. Fernanda fell to her knees beside her and hugged her desperately. Catalina didn't know how long they stayed like that, but for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. Catalina still felt her body trembling as she clung to her mother. Her breathing was erratic, her muscles aching from the tension built up, and her mind was still processing everything that had just happened. Emmanuel was standing next to her, his knuckles bloody and his breathing ragged. But the worst hadn't happened yet. Benjamin was still out there. He hadn't left. The silhouette of his body was visible through the faint moonlight coming in through the barn door. He wasn't moving. He was just there, watching them. Catalina could feel it. Fernanda still held the fork in her hand, her fingers clenched tightly around the handle. Her chest was rising and falling violently. Her eyes, which once looked at Benjamin with admiration and trust, now reflected a mix of fury, disappointment, and a guilt so deep it seemed to be devouring her from the inside. Benjamin didn't take long to move. With the calm of a man who had always known how to manipulate circumstances in his favor, he stepped forward. "Fernanda, you're making a mistake." His voice was calm, as if he truly believed he could control the situation. Catalina felt the rage rise in her throat. "Don't take another step." Fernanda's voice sounded louder than she had ever heard it before. Benjamin smiled smugly. "Listen to me, please. This is all a misunderstanding. You're letting your daughter poison you with lies." Fernanda pressed her lips together. Her eyes moved from Benjamin to Catalina. Catalina felt her chest tighten. "Are you going to believe her?" Benjamin tilted his head with feigned disappointment. "Look at what she's done. She's hidden this guy from you." "Who is he? What is he doing here?" "Doesn't it seem strange that, just when I start suspecting her, she shows up with this stranger, making up accusations against me?" Emmanuel stepped forward. "I'm not a stranger." Benjamin laughed coldly. "Oh, really? Then tell me, what are you doing in my house?" Catalina felt her anger explode. "It's not your house." Benjamin looked at her calmly, as if waiting for her. "What's wrong, Catalina? Are you afraid your mom will know the truth?" Fernanda closed her eyes for a moment. Catalina felt panic. "Mom, tell me you believe me." Fernanda opened her eyes and looked at her. "Catalina." Catalina felt her stomach twist. "You can't doubt this. Not after what you saw." Benjamin scoffed. "What she saw was her daughter with a hairpin and a stranger hitting me." Fernanda put a hand to her mouth. Catalina felt the world closing in. "No, Mom, no. You can't fall for this." Emmanuel stepped closer. "He's manipulating you." Fernanda shuddered. Benjamin smiled. "Come on, love. What your daughter is saying doesn't make sense." "I love you." Catalina felt nauseous. "Mom." Then Fernanda did the unexpected. She dropped the hairpin and walked towards Benjamin. Catalina felt her body freeze. "No." But before she could say anything else, Fernanda raised her hand and slapped him so hard that the sound echoed throughout the barn. The impact made Benjamin turn his face to the side. Catalina's jaw dropped. Emmanuel held his breath. Fernanda stepped back, her hand trembling. "I saw you." Benjamin slowly turned his head and looked at her coldly. "What did you say?" "I saw you," Fernanda swallowed. Benjamin narrowed his eyes. "You don't know what you saw." Fernanda shook her head. "I saw the way you looked at her. I saw how you tried to deceive me even when you had her cornered. Catalina felt her legs tremble. No, it can't be. Fernanda closed her eyes for a second, as if she were swallowing her own shame. I made up the business trip. I wanted to see if what Catalina was saying was true. Benjamin took a step back. You're wrong. Fernanda shook her head. No, Benjamin. You made me wrong. Catalina felt the tears running down her cheeks. Fernanda took a deep breath and pointed to the barn exit. Leave. Benjamin frowned. You can't do this. Fernanda didn't blink. Leave or I'll call the police. Benjamin stared at her. For the first time, he wasn't smiling. He didn't have control. His jaw tightened. Catalina gripped Emmanuel's hand tightly. Benjamin glanced at her. He turned without saying anything else. He left the barn. The sound of his footsteps fading away felt like the only music Catalina wanted to hear. When he finally disappeared into the darkness, Fernanda exhaled all the air from her lungs. Catalina didn't move. Fernanda turned to her and, for the first time, looked at her with the one expression Catalina had wanted to see from the start. I'm sorry. Catalina felt like she was torn in two. You didn't believe me. Fernanda swallowed hard. I know. You left me alone. Fernanda squeezed her eyes shut tightly. I know. Catalina felt all the rage, all the pain, all the despair overflowing from her body. How could you? Fernanda stepped closer cautiously. Catalina. No. You can't fix this with a I'm sorry. Fernanda felt her own guilt crushing her chest. I don't want you to forgive me. Catalina shuddered. Then what do you want? Fernanda looked at her with a broken heart. I want you to be safe. Catalina didn't know what to say. Silence took over the barn. Emmanuel watched them silently. Catalina closed her eyes. I don't know if I can forgive you. Fernanda nodded. I don't expect you to. The words floated in the air. Catalina stayed there, with Emmanuel by her side. The danger had passed. But the pain was still there. And it wouldn't disappear overnight. Days later, Catalina couldn't remember the last time she had felt peace. The world around her had been a constant chaos, a prison of fear and hopelessness, a place where every shadow seemed to hide a new danger. But now, for the first time in months, the silence wasn't terrifying. The wind moved the leaves of the trees, and the morning sun came through the living room window. Catalina was sitting on the couch, hugging her legs, staring blankly at the wooden floor. Fernanda was in the kitchen, making coffee in an attempt to regain normalcy. Emmanuel was on the porch, arms crossed, staring at the dirt road. It had been 3 days since Benjamin had disappeared that night. 3 days during which Fernanda hadn't stopped trembling, Catalina had barely slept, and Emmanuel had stayed close, as if his very presence could protect them from any danger still lurking in the darkness. But Catalina knew Benjamin was still out there. He wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat. Fernanda returned to the living room with 2 cups of coffee. Her hands were thinner, her face paler. It was clear from her gaze that she hadn't found peace since that night in the barn. We have to report him, she said, placing the cup in front of Catalina. Catalina slowly lifted her head. It won't do any good. Fernanda sat beside her and let out a sigh. It has to help. Emmanuel entered the house and leaned against the doorframe. If we report him, at least it will be on record. Catalina took the coffee cup in her hands, feeling the warmth seep through her fingers. And then what? Do we wait for the police to do something? Emmanuel fell silent. He knew that justice didn't always arrive for those who really needed it. Fernanda clenched her jaw. At least, if he comes back, we'll have proof of his previous history. Catalina turned her head to look at her. I don't want him to come back. Fernanda swallowed. He won't come back. Catalina wanted to believe her, but fear was a ghost that was hard to exorcise. The report was filed quickly. The police listened to them, took notes, asked questions. But the truth was, without physical evidence, without witnesses to corroborate what Catalina said, they couldn't do anything but open a file. If he comes near again, call immediately, said the officer who had attended to them, with the bored tone of someone who had heard too many similar stories. Emmanuel clenched his fists. Catalina felt the frustration form like a knot in her throat. The world was designed to protect monsters. But there was something Benjamin didn't count on. The people. In a small town, secrets didn't last long. In less than a week, the story of what had happened at Fernanda's house spread like wildfire through the community. Benjamin was seen at the market, and people stopped attending to him. He tried to speak with old friends, and they all turned their backs on him. No one wanted to associate with a man marked by something so atrocious. Catalina listened to the stories with a certain bitter satisfaction. It wasn't justice, but at least it meant he could no longer pretend nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Emmanuel had to make a decision. "I can't keep hiding." Catalina looked at him intently. "I don't want you to leave." Emmanuel sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I don't have any documents, Catalina. Legally, I still belong to my father." Catalina felt a sharp pang of anger in her chest. Fernanda, who had been listening to the conversation from the kitchen, entered the room and crossed her arms. "We're going to fix that." Emmanuel looked up. Fernanda looked at him with determination. "I'm going to find a way to emancipate you." Emmanuel frowned. "That's complicated." Fernanda shrugged. "Benjamin was complicated, and I still got rid of him." Catalina smiled wryly. Fernanda hired a lawyer, a man named Matthias, who seemed to have endless patience for difficult cases. The process took time, but slowly, things began to move. Emmanuel was recognized as a case of domestic abuse. His father was notified, but never responded. And finally, after months of paperwork and signatures, Emmanuel gained his legal independence. Catalina hugged him tightly when they received the news. "You're free." Emmanuel held her just as tightly. "I've always been." But the truth was, he hadn't felt that way until that moment. Things began to change. Fernanda, who had spent so much time in denial, started to rebuild herself. Catalina still had open wounds, but little by little, she began to find space for laughter again. And Emmanuel. Emmanuel had always been there. He became part of the family, the constant that Catalina needed to remember that life could go on. And over time, without realizing it, what started as friendship and unconditional support began to turn into something more. Catalina and Emmanuel fell in love during shared silences and fleeting glances. It wasn't sudden. It was something that grew with time, with scars healing, with nights where they only had each other. Fernanda noticed before they did. "You're in love," she said one night while preparing dinner. Catalina nearly dropped the glass she was holding. "What?" Fernanda smiled calmly. "Am I going to have to explain it to you?" Catalina blushed up to her ears. Emmanuel chuckled quietly. No need. Love became her refuge. Life kept moving forward. Fernanda, after a long time, allowed someone else into her world. Matthias, the lawyer who had helped them with Emmanuel, became a constant presence. Catalina noticed this one day while he and her mother were talking in the living room. Fernanda was laughing. Catalina realized she hadn't heard that laugh in a long time. Months turned into years. Catalina and Emmanuel grew up together. They built something new from the remnants of the past. And Fernanda, after living so many years with the weight of guilt, finally found peace. The past didn't disappear. The scars never completely faded. But they learned to live with them. Because life wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about moving forward, no matter what. Catalina looked at Emmanuel years later and smiled. "We made it." Emmanuel took her hand. "Yes, we did." The wind gently blew through the window. And for the first time in a long time, Catalina felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments what you would do in a similar situation. We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family to show your support. It motivates us to keep posting emotional stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We greatly value having you here with us. You can click the links that are appearing on your screen right now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. Hugs.